If you want to understand the history of the Salvation Army, you must know something about the Booth family. Now, obviously, you do already know something about the Booth family. You have very able instructors in Salvation Army history, and you have been studying the beginnings of the movement, and you know something about that outstanding family which had so much to do with those early beginnings. Surely no family in Christian history has produced so many great religious, so many world-renowned religious leaders. First of all, when has the church ever seen a team comparable to Catherine and William Booth? And they need to be arranged in that sequence, alphabetically, because they are of equal importance. Don't let anybody ever tell you that William Booth founded the Salvation Army. He didn't, of course. The Salvation Army was founded by Catherine and William Booth. And both of them sent their influence throughout its ranks. We will never be able to know what kind of army we would have had if Catherine Booth had lived, but certainly the impact which she made up until October 1890 was magnificent. And then in addition, there were more world-renowned preachers, sons and daughters who traveled the world and whose voices became known in some of the greatest auditoriums of the great cities of the world. It's a most unusual story. There were 10, well, were there 10 or 11? I guess your history book would say there were 10. But contemporary research makes us wonder about that, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. We will try to see them as real people, very human people. We tend, I think, to put our saints in stained glass windows with halos around their heads. They weren't really like that at all. They were very, very human, as we shall discover, beset by all kinds of human testings and temptations and inclinations. There is a very complete chart of the Booth family, which was prepared at this college and probably contains as much information on the family as can be found in any similar chart. It's constantly under review and correction as more and more research is done. Certainly there were no two of them alike. They were all very, very different. Different in style, different in administration, different in personality. Most of them were eloquent preachers. Not all of them. Most of them were world-renowned preachers. Unfortunately, recording equipment was not available back in the earliest days of the Booths. So we don't know about the voices of most of them except by historical record. We do know something about Evangeline Booth, of course, whose voice was heard very often in this country, traveling up and down the country as she governed the Salvation Army for those 30 years that she was stationed here. Really, legally, there was no Evangeline Booth, you know. That really wasn't her name at all. I can prove it. There's a copy of her birth certificate. And it says very clearly that she was named Eveline Booth. E-V-E-L-I-N-E, sometimes spelled with a Y. And this is signed by William Booth, her father, who ought to know. And it was registered only a very few days after her birth, when he had just given her the name of Eveline. Eveline Corey. Oh, why do we call her Evangeline then? Because she adopted that name. When she came to America, she became Evangeline. Up until that time, in Great Britain, she was known primarily as Miss Eva. But we know her as Evangeline. Evangeline Booth was an outstanding speaker, of course, and we'll listen to her voice in a few moments. But she was also an outstanding sportsman. And I suggested that we were going to talk about these people as human beings, not as saints in stained glass windows. She was a horsewoman of considerable skill. She was an outstanding swimmer and diver. I've got proof. There she is, diving off the diving board at Star Lake Camp. in what was at that time a quite daring bathing suit, let me hasten to say. And a little note on the back. This was given to Marion Higgins Zealy. And she writes on the back, "To my little swimmer, with the hope that I shall soon see her doing as well and better than this, signed Evangeline Booth." Evangeline Booth. Bramwell was different. Bramwell was primarily a teacher. He wasn't outstanding for his eloquence. Primarily, he was the administrator. Herbert was the visual aids expert. He is the man who illustrated what he was saying. He was a Bible scholar of the highest order, but he preferred to put it in more visible terms. It is he who was the father of the motion picture industry in Australia. If you read secular history, you will discover his name listed as the first of those in Australia to use the moving picture projector of that day, a very primitive kind of machine. He developed an illustrated lecture, which he used a great deal in Australia. In due course, it came to this country with him and then was lost. They have been trying for years to find a copy of Herbert Booth's great cinematograph performance. I find a newspaper clipping from the Chicago Daily News of May 5th, the year unidentified. The headline says, "To Save Sinners by Drama. Herbert Booth plans a religious theater to preach the gospel." Herbert had just arrived in this country. To preach the gospel through the eye by means of a religious theater is the plan of Herbert Booth, son of General Booth, whose resignation from the Salvation Army is still a mystery. And in 1987 it still is. He came to New York almost directly from Zion City, the headquarters of Dowieism, but he denies that he has joined the Dowie movement. "The movement I am going to start in New York," said he, "is meant to solve the problem of the unreached masses. It was for this that my father started the Salvation Army. My appeal is to the eye. I am going to form in this city of New York a great theater with a powerful company of Christian actors. My movement is to be known as the Scientific Evangelization Society, and it will be for the purpose of sending broadcast illustrated Bible dramas. I expect to get such great writers as Kennan Farrer to write powerful dramas for me. These I will have presented in continuous pictures by the cinematograph, the forerunner of the motion picture machine." Well, apparently the idea died a borning because we hear no more about that Scientific Evangelization Society. But he did become known throughout his ministry for his illustrated lectures. Emma, how I would love to have heard Emma in the pulpit. They say that she was a unique combination of her father and mother. She had all of the precise diction and perfect English of her mother, but all of the fire and enthusiasm of her father. Certainly she captivated audiences all across this country. Ballington was perhaps the greatest of them all as far as preaching is concerned. I have a typescript of a volume which was written about Ballington Booth, never published because the publisher felt that there would not be sufficient market for it. But the biographer, Herbert Wisby, who did some writing for the Salvation Army, says, "General Ballington Booth found his calling in the pulpit. He was recognized as one of the outstanding preachers of the day. He had that sense of dramatic appeal coupled with a sincerity of purpose that moved large audiences. In addition to his rich oratorical talent, he had a deep baritone voice. Above all, he was a preacher whose primary aim was to proclaim Christ's message of salvation to as wide an audience as possible. When he left the ranks of the Salvation Army, he was offered a very prestigious pulpit, the Broadway Tabernacle in New York, a tabernacle which had been founded by Charles Grandison Finney. Many of them had songs published, at least 7 of them, and there are a great many of those songs in our present songbook. A fascinating study would be to go through the songbook and pick out all of those by the Booth family and discover the circumstances under which they were written. I think that we can find the history of the Salvation Army in its songs. If you are to take all of the songs written by Salvationists and arrange them in the sequence in which they were written, you will see emerging all of the various eras of Salvation Army history. It's a fascinating study. And certainly that is true as far as the songs by the Booth family are concerned. They reflect the personal problems which they were facing, the crises through which they were passing, and the eras of Salvation Army history which they represented. 1 or 2 of them had rather humorous birth. Some had very tragic births. Look, for example, at 301. The Booth Tuckers were stationed at International Headquarters. Booth Tucker rode back and forth on the London bus to 101 Queen Victoria Street. Each morning he climbed up that little circular stairway. You've all been to London, and you have all ridden the London buses, I presume, but if you haven't, there's a circular stairway that goes up to the 2nd level. That's the most economical way to see London. You just buy a bus ticket, get up on the upper level, and ride for hours. He came home one day in a great hurry, and he said, "Emma, as I went up the stairway, there came a melody. I want you to write it down quickly and find some words for it. I was going up this circular stairway, and the melody goes like this. Da 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 da." So quickly Emma wrote it down, and you could just see him climbing up that circular stairway. Every time you sing, "I am climbing up the golden stairs to glory." Some of them had more tragic and more solemn backgrounds. There isn't time to go into the history of those songs. I did discover a fascinating thing in my research. I researched carefully the biographies of the Marechal Catherine, of the Commandant Herbert, of the Marshal Ballington. All of them wrote songs which we sing today with great profit and great spiritual refreshment and insight. But as far as I can determine, not one of them wrote one single song after they left the army. Now, there may have been some songs that I haven't been able to discover, but as far as I can determine, the Spirit apparently ceased to give them that kind of inspiration, or the muse just discontinued his ministry to them, and they no longer wrote any songs. One of the members of the family is very little known. We read about the more outstanding pulpiteers of the family, but we don't know very much about the one who was, what was she? Was she retarded? I suppose so. Was she sickly? Yes, certainly she was very sickly. There's almost nothing known about her. One wonders how she fit into that busy household with this company of brilliant children. There is one who isn't brilliant. I searched all the records to find what I could about her. I find a childhood memory from Evangeline. On one occasion, Evangeline and Marion, the little sickly girl, were busy at their lessons. And Marion, says the biographer, was never able to study very much. And she infuriated the governess by her slowness. So that lady took hold of the child's beautiful hair and pulled her head first this way and the other. Evangeline recalled the verse from the Bible that Mama often quoted to her children. "Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy might." So Eveline shot out her small hand and slapped the cheek of the governess. unheard of in Victorian days. The governess said, "Go straight to bed, you wicked child." Well, the housekeeper who was there, a lovely lady named Emma Westbrook, about whom you have heard in other settings. Emma Westbrook came to her rescue and took her up some jam tarts to hold her through till breakfast the next day. But it was quite obvious in that simple domestic setting that they were protective of little Marion, more often known as Marie. In the biographies, I find some reference. Catherine Bramwell Booth says, Marie fell ill with smallpox. And then she quotes a letter from the Army mother which says, "I hope Katie is not neglecting Marie's and Lucy's music. It is important now, and especially Marie's." And again, it says, before she fell fatally ill, all Catherine's children, except Marie, an unassuming, sincere Christian, were officers and preachers in the Salvation Army. Harold Begbie says, following an accident, she developed serious physical weakness and was only reared to an invalid life with considerable difficulty. It's really about all we know about her. She lived in New York for 15 years with the Booth Tuckers. And if you want a picture of her, you will look at the film entitled God's Soldier. In that film, there is a sequence showing the funeral procession of the consul. And seated in the carriage with the members of the family is Marion. One of the very few pictures ever seen of Marion. I have this one photograph, which is the only photograph, as far as I know, in existence of Marion Booth. The history book says that the third daughter has been prevented by her delicate constitution from taking an active part in the public work of the Salvation Army. She makes her home with Consul Mrs. Booth Tucker in New York. I do have a war cry report of her funeral. Staff Captain Marion Booth goes to heaven. And there's a very interesting comment from her sister, General Evangeline Booth. She says, Aunt Marie was God's instrument for drawing godlike qualities from those around her. So apparently she had a very quiet ministry behind the scenes. I do read the story of the last days of Catherine Booth when all of the family, all except Valentin, gathered around the bedside, and she went around the circle giving some parting word to each member of the family. And she came to Marion and said, "Anne Marie, you will take care of the children." Well, that in itself is a gift, isn't it? The ability to communicate with the children and care for them adequately. That's about all we know about Marion. And I suspect that that's all we're going to know, because any still existing members of the family are not going to share with us any further details about her life. Most of them were brilliant administrators. Their capacity for work was absolutely unbelievable. They carried on correspondence on trains, on boats, at all hours of the day or night. They administered the affairs at a very young age of very large geographical areas of a burgeoning, growing Salvation Army. And they were, without exception, excellent administrators. I came across a letter from Emma, dated on an August night in 1899, New York. Her office was on West 14th Street. I occupied an office on West 14th Street for a lot of years, and I know how sultry and hot it can get on West 14th Street. And she says, "It is now past 10:30 at night, and I am just starting on the day's mail." Well, that sounds very familiar. A lot of us have been faced with that problem. But obviously she was keeping up with this constant flow of correspondence. And as they went from country to country and territory to territory, serving in all kinds of cultures through all kinds of translations and languages, all kinds of situations, governmentally and socially. They administered the work of the Salvation Army skillfully. The greatest among them, of course, was Bramwell. It is Bramwell who organized the Salvation Army. It has been said that William Booth founded the movement, that Catherine Booth gave the movement its heart, that George Scott Railton made us an army, and that Bramwell organized us. Well, that's a dangerous generalization, of course, but there is an element of truth in it. Certainly, Bramwell organized us. And all the organizational structures to which we've become accustomed in these latter days have been primarily the result of the organizational skill of Bramwell Booth. He was an exponent of holiness, of course. He suffered from ill health through much of his life, and in his early life there was some considerable doubt that he would ever be able to handle a public ministry. But he found his place in organizing, so that William Booth was able to travel the world without worrying very much about what was happening back at 101 Queen Victoria Street, because he knew that it was in the hands, the very capable hands, of his chief of the staff, and later his successor as general. Brilliant administrators. One of the reasons that the Salvation Army has survived through these 100+ years is not only the spirit which has permeated the movement, and about which we will speak on Monday morning, but also the fact that we were organized skillfully into a movement. I believe in organization and administration. It was no great surprise then when William Booth went to glory and they opened the vault in which he had left the name of his successor. It was no great surprise to discover the name of Bramwell Booth. It wasn't just a little slip of paper that said Bramwell Booth on it. It was a much more impressive document, as you see. All sealed and notarized. And it says, I do hereby nominate and appoint my son, William Bramwell Booth, the Chief of the Staff of the Salvation Army, to be my successor and to succeed me as from the time of my decease in the office of General Superintendent and Commanding Officer of the Salvation Army. Terminology was still in state of flux. In the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, India, where's the United States? Oh, we're there, it says, and elsewhere throughout the world. He doesn't list all of the countries in which the Army was serving at that time. They were administrators. One of them you've probably never heard of. How much do you know about George Booth? Did you ever hear about him? Hardly anybody has. His name is just now emerging. And I think we probably already know as much about him as we're ever going to know. Because I don't think anybody is going to tell us anymore. And the only one who could tell us anymore is now well over 100 years old and not in very stable health. Jump back to the Christian Mission Conference in 1877. William Booth is making a report to the conference of the Christian Mission. And he says, I believe I can say for my dear wife as for myself that we have no greater joy than to see our children devote themselves to the redemption and salvation of the masses. May God accept all 9 of our children for this service. All 9. Where did you get the 9th, General? I only find 8. Well, a quick count of the Booth offspring, says Genty Fairbank, must have left the more astute of the Christian Mission membership wondering. Later, it became further complicated when, in 1878, a newspaper reported an address by Catherine Booth and said, Mrs. Booth gave a short address. She also stated that they had 9 sons. all coming on, ready to fight in the great conflict against sin, the flesh, and the devil. Well, says Major Fairbank, the son's mistake could be forgiven, reporters being what they are. But 9 was the constant factor. Never has it been known for both parents, even of a large Victorian family, to overcount the number of mouths to be fed. Then there's a story a year later. We had become the Salvation Army. There was a council of war, and a testimony was being given by a navvy from Canning Town. He said he was passing the Salvation Army barracks, and says he, the general's little son came out and took my hand and brought me into the meeting. The general's little son. Well, the general's youngest son was Herbert. So I checked the dates. Herbert was 17 years old that year. So it couldn't have been Herbert. There must have been another son. Later, we read about a meeting referred to by Herbert, and there are various members of the family taking part. He said Emma wasn't able to come because of an indisposition. However, Emma has sent to represent her younger sister and brother, Lucy and Georgie Booth, who would now sing in public for the first time. Little Georgie did his part manfully, said Herbert. And when his sister sat down, he remained standing and told us that though he had been very nervous too, he was glad to know that he was also one of God's little soldiers. Why haven't we heard about George before? I read about him in T.H.K., a book which was published a number of years ago, the story of Theodore Kitching. Theodore Kitching was a father of General Kitching. And Theodore Kitching was appointed to accompany George Booth to the United States. This lad, said to be the son of a nobleman, had been adopted by William and Catherine Booth, although they already had a family of 7 children of their own at that time. And he had been sent to William Kitching's Quaker school. And the principal's son, Theodore Kitching, had worked with him as a student. According to him, George was a very sweet, docile boy. And so it was planned at that time, in 1889, that Kitching would accompany George Booth to the United States. Why? And so Theodore says, I've talked to Father and Mother about going as proposed with George to the States, and I think everything is satisfactory. They don't have any serious objection. We leave from Southport on Tuesday and so forth. Mother sends her very dear love. Of course, she is not overwilling to part with me. And 3 weeks later, Kitching was appointed to Paris. And apparently the plan fell through. Why? I have no way of knowing. The last word we have on George comes from a highly classified letter which has been loaned to me from the archives in London, with the understanding that most of it will not be quoted publicly. But it is a letter from Ballington in New York to Bramwell in London to say, in effect, George has arrived. This is June 17th, 1890. George has arrived. In line with your instructions, we have placed him on the train for Chicago, where he will enter into employment. That's the last we hear of George Booth. And for most of it's probably also the first that we have ever heard of George Booth. There were other boys also living in the Booth home. George Scott Railton lived there for years, of course, as a young man. Harry Andrews lived there as a boy. But this is the only one who was actually adopted by Catherine and William Booth, as far as we know. Well, they were very human. They were strongly independent, these Booths. They were subject to all kinds of emotional pressures. Some stresses developed, some relationships were strained. The founder faced 5 great tragedies in his life. The first, of course, was in 1890 in October when Catherine died. We'll talk about that later. That was devastating to him. But there were 4 others. In 1896, farewell orders came in the usual way to Ballington and Maud Booth. They were to farewell from New York on January 31st, 1896. Now, it's easy to say that they got their farewell orders and refused their appointment. It wasn't quite as simple as that. He came as a very young man. They came as a very young couple. Maybe the job was too big. We just heard a few minutes ago about his great prowess as a preacher. Certainly he accomplished magnificent things in the United States during his stay here. Magnificent. He reunited the Army. He brought it back together after the disastrous split. He expanded the Army. He brought the Army to a position of great prestige in the minds of the people of the country. But then something happened. He just didn't want to leave the United States. Had it, and I say it cautiously, had it all gone to his head? When he refused his appointment, Bramwell cabled to Herbert, who was then stationed in Toronto. And Herbert came down to Montclair, New Jersey, where they were living, to talk with him. I have a copy of Herbert's report. I appealed to his love to the general. I referred to the general's gray hairs and his life service as a father and a leader. He replied by saying in a most laughing and bitter manner, "Gray hairs? Wait till he gets my last letter and his hair will come out." Here are the words of a bitter, childish man. He had no longer any love for the general. He did not believe he was a man of God. There was no religion about him. He was disliked in America from the end to end of the country. He wouldn't take another appointment under him for all the world. I declared most solemnly that his bitterness and guile against his father in general was beyond anything I ever heard or experienced. I told him he could not defend such a spirit for a moment. The correspondence is petulant. I have read through reams and reams of correspondence between Ballington and Maud in New York and William and Bramwell in London. For example, they had a son named William, and the old general was very proud that he had a grandson namesake over in New York, William Booth. But they went to court and had his name changed. They weren't going to have any William Booth in their house. In one of his letters, the founder writes, he was evidently determined to break loose, and he hunted about to find reasons, but this unwillingness to be reasoned with, this impossibility of getting at his heart, this indifference to past and present affection and relationships is staggering. Oh, Ballington, Ballington, what can it all mean? His portrait still hangs on the wall of the room where I eat my food, and Willie's is on the mantel shelf. I cannot put them away. Then it was Catherine and Arthur Booth Cliburn. Booth Cliburn got caught up with a Dr. John Alexander Dowie in Zion City, Illinois, a so-called faith healer who had built up a commercial empire near Chicago. The story of the subsequent relationship is sickening, it's sordid, it's heartbreaking. Here's an editorial from a Christian magazine, not Army, of those days. This man, Dowie, has given out that he is the prophet Elijah reincarnated, and that all who do not join him are apostate from Christ. He's been exposed by the English and American press, the most gross and obnoxious and offensive type of charlatanism. It appears inexplicable that any Christian should be led away by a man of this type when there are such abundant and unmistakable marks of error about him and his sect. Let us join in prayer, says this editorial, with the Salvation Army, that Mrs. Booth Cliburn and her husband may be speedily disillusioned and restored and that comfort may be brought to the heart of him whom God has so signally honored as the general of the Salvation Army. Booth Cliburn never did get disillusioned, unfortunately. Although there is evidence that Catherine, his wife, never was baptized into Dowieism and remained somewhat aloof from the movement. As a matter of fact, there's recorded evidence in that regard. I have a report here from Frederick Booth Tucker with regard to the separation of the Booth Cliburns. Much too long to read, but it does give something of the atmosphere which it created in the United States and something of the tragedy which it brought to William Booth. Then there was Herbert. What was the problem with Herbert? Herbert was that beautiful songwriter whose words mean so much to us today. Why did he leave the ranks? As suggested by the newspaper report that we read earlier, it is somewhat of a mystery. He was the territorial commander in Australia. He asked his father to be relieved of his command so that he could go in charge of a farm colony in the territory which he commanded, which is a rather unusual procedure, to say the least. In due course, he got a telegram from his sister Catherine in Chicago asking for help. What kind of help? What interesting doors that opens up. And so he came to San Francisco, where his sister Catherine met him, and they headed towards Zion City. He was soon disillusioned with Dowie. He didn't stay there at all. He had much more sense than that, and continued on to Yonkers, New York, where he settled into a sort of an itinerant evangelistic ministry. He was a pacifist who kept pressing his pacifist ideas and so forth, but always he was the sweet-spirited Christian, and she held him, as did all of the other members of the family, including Bramwell, the general at that time, in highest regard. Then there was Emma. Emma, totally loyal, utterly lovable. Came with her husband to the United States at a time of deep trouble when the Salvation Army was disintegrating, falling apart as a result of the defection of the Ballingtons. And they brought the army together again, reunited us, met all kinds of opposition. We will never really adequately be able to assess the historical importance of the Booth Tuckers of the United States Salvation Army. I have letters here, originals. Letters written by William Booth to his daughter Emma. My dear, dear Emma, how can I write you to make you understand how much I appreciate your devotion? And so forth. And then a typical fatherly letter, the way we fathers sometimes do to our daughters. You just scribble something off in a hurry. My dear Emma, hallelujah, and so forth. Then suddenly, in her early 40s, she's crushed beneath a derailed railway car and suddenly ushered into glory. They bring the news, they cable the news to London. Bramwell says, I must take this personally out to Hadley Wood, to the old general. And so he conveyed the tragic information that Emma had gone. Maybe the worst tragedy of it all. Well, they were children of spiritual giants, these Booths. Here's William, who was a towering religious and organizing genius. I think his stature will continue to grow. His beginnings were in poverty. His father was a poor manager, but he did at least get him baptized. There's William Booth's baptismal certificate, showing that he really was born legally and legitimately, William Booth, the son of Samuel and Mary Booth. Why such poverty? The reason for the poverty was a change in men's styles. Isn't that fascinating? The Salvation Army owes its dedication to the poor to a change in men's styles. The chief industry in Nottingham was making long woolen stockings for men. And then men began to wear long trousers and didn't wear these long woolen stockings anymore. And the mills all closed down. And Nottingham was thrown into an economic depression for which it did not recover for decades. Thousands of people were out of work. And into this milieu came young William Booth, apprenticed to a pawnbroker, and in that position came into close contact with that poverty every day. So he had a great affinity for those who were poor. First of all, he became a preacher. I'm not going to go over all the historical details of William Booth's life. You studied those in your history class, I'm sure, and you're very well aware of them. The world, of course, knows him as a great social reformer, the author of Darkest England and The Way Out, and some of the great moves which he initiated to redeem society and the poor. Basically, however, we must always remember that he was primarily and first of all an evangelist, primarily a preacher of the Word, a powerful, powerful preacher of the Word. And he was always at his greatest on the platform. But he was a very human person. I wish there were time for us to talk about some of the little evidences of that humanity which one reads all through the letters and correspondence and articles of that day, much more than one finds in the official biographies of William Booth. He was a very human and a very gentle and very sympathetic man. I read a story which was written by a very elderly retired officer and published a long, long time ago, describing a scene when they were young captains in charge of their first corps. The general came to town. And after the Sunday night meeting, as was his custom, he went to the billet. In England, of course, supper is at about 8 or 8:30 in the evening. And he went to the billet for his evening meal. It was a very beautiful home, a mansion. A very wealthy family was entertaining him. They were preparing to sit down for supper, and he turned to his host and said, "Sir, but where is the captain?" "Well, it had never occurred, General, to me to invite the captain." "Well," said the general, "we'll wait a few moments." The general was always in charge at his home or anybody else's. "You will send one of your servants for the captain." And so in a few minutes, the servant came hurrying back with the captain. And the general said, "But, Captain, you are a married man. Your wife has been very busy all day entertaining this great crowd of people who have come to your barracks. We will wait a few moments, and my host will send his servant to bring your wife." And so they waited again. And very quickly the servant came back with the wife all afluster. And the general said, "You have been working so hard today. It is time we will rearrange the seating. The Mrs. Captain will sit on my right, and the captain will sit on my left." And said he, "Do you see that big piece of chicken on the plate? We don't get to eat chicken very often, do we, Mrs. Captain? We're saving that for you." And so the meal went forward, always interested. Sometimes we miss the human side of William. Don't put a halo around his head. He was a great spiritual and humanitarian genius, but he was very, very human. Well, we must talk about the Army Mother. When we talk about the Army Mother, we feel that we're standing on holy ground. She was plagued all of her life with ill health. She spent most of her younger years, many of her younger years in bed, reading constantly. So that by the time she became a teenager, she was intellectually well-read and mature, even though physically she was ill and weak. She had her share of problems in family life. Her father, you recall, had been a preacher of some considerable note, And then he withdrew from preaching and became a temperance worker, and then began to tipple a little and a little and a little. And the temperance leader became an alcoholic. So Catherine Booth was brought up as a teenager in the home of a drunkard. A hard-working drunkard who earned a fairly good living when he was sober. She had a brother, an elder brother, about whom she was very much concerned, and she prayed for him often, but he never would accept Christ. I came across a rather pitiful little reference in the War Cry of March 22nd, 1890, 6 months before Catherine Booth died. Mrs. General Booth's brother, for whose salvation she yearns so much, lives in San Francisco. Oh, may the merciful God give her the desire of her heart. One of the San Francisco headquarters staff keeps him posted as to her condition, as he is concerned about her critical state of health. We have no record whether or not her only brother ever came back to the Lord. There is some reason to believe, although it's not documented, that her father in his later years returned to Christ. Just as the army was rapidly developing, her mother died after a long bout of cancer. And so she had her share of problems during her years of family life. She took a very keen interest in everything that was happening in the Army. She was very much involved in the organization of the Army. I have a letter here that she wrote in her latter years to a young woman officer who had just become one of the first woman divisional commanders in the Salvation Army's history. And so she writes, "In my sick chamber, I have heard of your promotion to the command of a division with great interest," and so forth and so on. And then over in the middle of the second page, apparently she was no longer able to write. She was very, very ill, dying of cancer. And so the rest of it is written in her husband's handwriting, much less easy to read, I must say. But it is still signed Catherine Booth. To her latest years, still keenly interested in everything that was happening in the movement, deeply involved in it all. What did she look like in the pulpit? We have all kinds of records of her preaching skill. Dr. Joseph Parker invited her to preach in City Temple, which was a very high honor indeed. And it is described in some detail in Catherine Bramwell Booth's biography. The mere record of her words cannot account for their effect. Judged as orator, teacher, advocate, she was among those who excel. But there was still something more, something between her and her congregation, known to them alone. An expert preacher and teacher of public speaking in those days was there at that particular meeting, and she said, "Above them all, to my mind, stands Catherine Booth. I cannot exactly describe the secret of the extraordinary, captivating power of her words, but her address remains unforgettable. Right from the beginning to the end, she brought me into the personal presence of Jesus Christ." In her congregation that morning was a young American theological student, S. Parks Cadman. In due course, S. Parks Cadman became one of the great preachers of the United States and occupied a pulpit just a block away from the Salvation Army Citadel in Brooklyn, New York. 40 years later, he's reflecting upon that meeting. He was there in City Temple. He says, "I have not heard since anything which moved me more deeply than that remarkable address, lasting at least an hour and a quarter, delivered in the purest English." I like that. "With faultless diction, in a voice like the pealing of a silver bell across a still lake." Oh, how I would love to have heard Catherine Booth. What did she look like? "She's a woman of no ordinary mind," says Booth Tucker. "Her powers of argument are of a superior character. Her delivery is calm, precise, and clear, without the least approach to formality or tediousness. Her language is simple, but well chosen. And her ability for speaking is far, far beyond the general order. But what of her life behind the scenes, her life as a wife and mother? There's a copy of their birth certificate. They were married on the 16th of June, 1855. He's listed as a bachelor dissenting minister, and she's listed as a spinster, which is a term that we don't use quite as often in these more modern days. And it is all properly signed and notarized. But what was she like to her children? Let me just conclude with these quotations from the consul. The consul, writing in those very early years a chapter entitled My Mother. I can almost feel them drop again in scalding heat of earnest longing upon my arm. I think I see her, the folds of her carefully protected dress concealed by a large checkered apron. Her face as bright and her smile as uplifting as the sunshine's rays, which shot through the kitchen window upon a busy scene. Piles of raisins here, potatoes freshly peeled there, dough newly kneaded, placed temptingly to rise within the reach of the open fire, while our mother's clever hands were busily engaged in preparing some other dainty which was to serve as a happy surprise to the children. It's a picture we don't always have of Catherine Booth. Very, very few. Few who saw our neat, well-fitting clothes imagined that they'd been homemade. Often my mother would be questioned as to who her tailor was. The surprised visitor would often catch her cutting out our garments with her own hands. And at night, when we had long since been lovingly tucked up to sleep, the hum of the sewing machine would serve as a lullaby, lasting until a late, late hour. This, too, was Catherine Booth. One of the great eulogies to be found anywhere is a eulogy given by William Booth at his wife's funeral. Not time to read it, but it's to be found in many history books. And if you want to read sublime eloquence, read her husband's tribute to her. Beautiful, beautiful words. I have the correspondence of Ballington Booth with his father and his brother, chief of the staff. I have what I think is the last letter that he wrote to International Headquarters. It was written in the spring of 1896. It was typewritten, undoubtedly by his wife, who wrote much of the correspondence. But at the bottom, he has written a little addendum, a postscript in his own hand. And these are the words written to his father. I, Ballington, note all you have to say about my dear mother. If she had lived, this would never have happened. Well, there's the Booth family, friends, showing, I hope, that they were very human people with all kinds of personality problems, but all of them, even those who felt it unwise to continue to serve under the flag of the Salvation Army, continuing a ministry which made its impact around the world. And when we sing their songs and when we reflect upon their ministry, we can be assured that the Salvation Army is built on a strong foundation.